The meeting had already run longer than expected. A projection screen filled the front wall of the conference room. Market forecasts, regional demand projections, and competitor analysis slides rotated slowly as the analyst continued speaking. Halfway through the presentation, she hesitated. The next slide contained three possible expansion scenarios. One predicted rapid growth, one predicted gradual adoption, the third predicted resistance in the market. Before she could continue, the CEO leaned slightly forward, not abruptly, not impatiently, just enough to interrupt the rhythm of the room. "We already know the direction." The analyst paused. No one spoke. The slide changed. The meeting continued. And from that moment on, the uncertainty that had filled the earlier discussions began to disappear. Not because it had been resolved, but because the conclusion had already been understood. The company had reached a moment of strategic tension. Growth in its core markets had begun to slow. Margins remained strong, but expansion opportunities were narrowing. The leadership team had spent months examining one possibility: entering a large international market that had long remained outside the company's reach. The opportunity looked promising. Demand indicators were encouraging. Local partners were available. Competitors had begun exploring similar expansion paths, but the analysis was still incomplete. Regional regulations remained uncertain. Customer behavior data was inconsistent. Some forecasts suggested strong adoption. Others suggested hesitation. Inside the organization, debate had quietly intensified. Strategy teams presented different models. Finance departments revised projections repeatedly. Regional advisors warned that conditions might change quickly. Uncertainty filled the room, which meant pressure began to build. In most institutions, uncertainty does not remain neutral for long. Eventually, someone must decide what direction the organization will believe. The CEO did not issue a formal directive. There was no announcement declaring the strategy final. Instead, certainty appeared gradually. During the next executive meeting, the CEO referred to the international market as our next growth phase. Later, during a quarterly planning session, he described the expansion as the direction we're moving toward. The language was subtle, but inside institutions, subtle signals travel quickly. Soon, analysts began adjusting their presentations. Forecast models started emphasizing expansion scenarios. Risk projections became shorter. Alternative outcomes appeared less frequently in reports. Meetings began moving faster. Debates that once lasted 40 minutes ended in 10. What had previously required explanation now seemed obvious. The organization was aligning. From a leadership perspective, this looked like progress. Alignment is one of the most visible signs of organizational health. When departments agree on direction, execution accelerates. Teams coordinate. Decisions move quickly. Momentum builds. And in the months following the CEO's expression of confidence, that momentum appeared everywhere. Project timelines shortened. Operational teams began preparing infrastructure. The company was moving forward. During one strategy meeting, a senior analyst opened a presentation containing 5 slides. The fourth slide showed a scenario labeled Alternative Market Resistance Forecast. It outlined conditions under which customer adoption might remain slow. Before presenting it, the analyst paused. Then she quietly skipped the slide. The meeting continued. No one asked about the missing scenario, not because it had been disproven, but because it no longer felt relevant to the direction everyone expected. Inside institutions, decisions rarely eliminate uncertainty. They simply reorganize which uncertainties are allowed to remain visible. And as the expansion strategy became increasingly accepted, the organization began to change. The first change was subtle. Information continued to flow through the organization. Reports were still written. Analysts continued updating forecasts. But the path those signals took began to shift. Data that reinforced the expansion strategy moved quickly. Positive customer indicators traveled upward through dashboards and briefings. Regional partners who supported the expansion received more attention. Meanwhile, signals that contradicted the direction slowed down. Local advisors expressing caution were scheduled later in presentations. Risk scenarios were summarized instead of explored. None of this required instruction. No policy demanded that conflicting information disappear. The organization simply adapted to the new expectation. Once leadership appears certain, institutions often reorganize themselves around that certainty. Not out of fear, but out of efficiency. Presenting information that aligns with the direction saves time. Presenting uncertainty feels less productive. Gradually, the system becomes extremely effective at executing the chosen strategy and less effective at questioning it. For a time, the decision appeared to work perfectly. The company's expansion attracted attention from investors. Early market entries showed promising adoption. Operational metrics improved. Internal morale increased as teams saw the strategy moving forward smoothly. The CEO's confidence now appeared validated. Within the organization, this success reinforced the new structure. Analysts became even more certain that the expansion would succeed. Departments aligned more tightly around the initiative, and the institution became increasingly coordinated around the belief that the strategy was correct, which produced an unexpected side effect. Doubt became unnecessary. The organization was now functioning efficiently, but it had quietly stopped exploring alternatives. Several months later, conditions in the international market began to change. A competitor introduced an unexpected pricing model. Local regulatory discussions slowed product approvals. Customer adoption patterns became less predictable. Under normal conditions, organizations detect these shifts gradually. Signals move through departments. Analysts update projections. Strategy teams begin discussing adjustments. But inside this company, those signals traveled more slowly, not because they were hidden, but because they had to move through a system that had already aligned around a conclusion. Regional managers reported early concerns. The reports were summarized. Finance teams revised projections. The changes appeared small. Strategy meetings continued focusing on execution rather than reassessment. By the time the full picture became visible, the institution had already built significant infrastructure around the expansion. Contracts had been signed. Operational investments had been made. Teams had been reorganized. Changing direction now required far more disruption than it would have earlier. The system had not failed. It had simply become slower at updating itself. What had begun as confident leadership had gradually produced several structural costs. Information began arriving in compressed form. Signals that contradicted the expansion strategy required more time to surface. Decision cycles became longer because questioning the direction required revisiting assumptions that had already been institutionalized. Operational teams became highly efficient at executing the strategy, but less prepared to reconsider it. None of these outcomes appeared dramatic. There was no crisis, no collapse, only a gradual shift in how the organization processed uncertainty. Confidence had stabilized the institution, but it had also narrowed how the institution absorbed new information. From the outside, the story appears simple. A CEO expressed confidence. The organization followed. But attempts to replicate this style of leadership often misunderstand what actually happened. What observers see is certainty. What they rarely see is the structural effect certainty has on information flow. Inside institutions, certainty does more than guide decisions. It shapes which signals continue circulating. When leaders appear confident, systems often reorganize themselves to reinforce that confidence. Alternative possibilities fade quietly. Doubt becomes inefficient, and the organization gradually stops updating its understanding as frequently as it once did. The visible result looks like alignment. The structural result is something else, a slower feedback loop. The expansion strategy eventually continued. Some aspects succeeded, others proved more difficult than expected. But the more interesting question remained unresolved. Did the CEO's early certainty strengthen the company, or did it quietly slow the system's ability to detect when conditions were changing? Inside complex institutions, certainty rarely arrives with clear consequences. Alignment feels efficient, confidence feels stabilizing, and doubt often looks like delay. Yet within large systems, doubt serves another function. It keeps information moving. When certainty arrives too early, institutions rarely collapse. They simply become slower at discovering when the world has changed. And by the time that discovery arrives, the organization may already be structured around a decision it no longer fully understands.